I'd like to thank Swamiji for inviting me again to come and share a few ideas with you on this special day. So our topic this morning is the Yoga of Self-Forgetfulness. For spiritual seekers, probably the most daunting challenge in our quest is dealing with that which is closest to us. Because that which is closest to us is the hardest to objectify and to see clearly. And what is that? It's our own self. That's the hardest. Sri Krishna's perspective on this issue of self, I feel, is one of his most important teachings that we can find in the Gita. What can possibly be more central in our life than our own self? This morning, I'd like to focus on Sri Krishna's approach to this issue of self that we are introduced to in the very beginning of the Gita, with his encounter with his beloved disciple and friend, Arjuna. And this is right before the beginning of the Kurukshetra war. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the story from the Mahabharata of the conflict between the two families, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. Long story short, these two families were warring for supremacy of the throne. The Kauravas had the wicked Duryodhana, and they were on the wrong side of Dharma. Arjuna, of course, was a celebrated warrior for the Pandavas. Now, the Kauravas had the largest army by far, but the Pandavas had Sri Krishna on their side. He was their friend. He would not take part in the war, but he was Arjuna's charioteer. And this was a decided advantage. Now, the Gita opens very dramatically, and the blind king Dhritarashtra has sent Sanjaya to report to him exactly what is happening on the field. All of the conches have been blown. This is all very dramatically described in the Gita, and the war is about to commence. And just at this moment, the most important thing happens in the Gita. And that's when Arjuna says to Sri Krishna, Senayor Ubhayor Madhye Ratham Stapaya. He says to Krishna, drive my chariot between the two armies. Madhya means between. Senayor Ubhayor, both armies. Put my chariot between. Why is he asking this? Let me see who are the enemies that I am about to fight. Now, this is very curious. Arjuna didn't need to see them. He knew who he was about to fight. So already we're getting a hint that Arjuna is wavering. He has a doubt. He says, let me see them. Then what happens? Krishna drives the chariot between the two armies, and Arjuna looks out, and he sees arrayed before him on the other side family members, close associates, his revered teachers. He sees Bhishma, his beloved grandfather. He sees Dronacharya, the master of archery, Kripacharya, master of science of ethics and war. All of this he sees, and he completely loses heart. All nerve vanishes from Arjuna at that point when he sees this. He knows it. Now he's experienced it. He's actually seen what he's up against. He forgets himself entirely. His throat becomes parched. His head starts to reel. He sees adverse omens on all sides. He's about to faint in a major meltdown. And at that point, he turns to Sri Krishna, and he tells him, this is happening to me. And his mighty bow, Gandiva, falls to the chariot floor. And then he proceeds to give Sri Krishna a big list of reasons of why he should not fight. If you read that description in the first chapter of the Gita, his reasons are very valid, rational, well thought out reasons. Very reasonable why he should not perform his duty. He lists all of those reasons for Sri Krishna. And having said that, he collapses on the chariot floor with his ultimate declaration, I will not fight. And there he sits, Now, this self-forgetfulness that Arjuna experienced is described in the Bhagavad Gita as Vishada Yoga. That's the title of the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. Vishada means grief, depression, despondency. So it's the yoga of despondency, Arjuna's grief. He's overwhelmed with grief when he sees he's going to be killing his own kinsman. So what happens next? Sri Krishna sees through Arjuna's mask. He sees through it. He scolds him. Instead of sympathizing with him, he scolds him. And he tells him, you're being selfish, weak, faint-hearted. These are terrible, crushing insults to a great warrior like Arjuna, to be told he's weak. And he tells him, he goads him, stand up, O Partha, O scorcher of foes, rise. Whence comes this mean faint-heartedness right at the critical moment of battle? Why are you behaving? You're speaking like a very wise man, but your behavior says otherwise. Why are you behaving in this manner? Now, Swami Vivekananda, this was one of his most favored verses of the Gita that starts, Klaibyam Masma Gama Partha. Get up. And we know Swamiji was always quoting from the Upanishads, arise, awake, stop not. So here, this instruction of Sri Krishna to Arjuna, stand up, throw off this weakness, do your duty, realize yourself. Swamiji was very fond of this verse. Now clearly Arjuna was having an identity crisis. He was totally bewildered about his duty as a kshatriya. Krishna knew what Arjuna finally wanted to do was to renounce the world, go into a forest, and live the life of a brahmana. Krishna knew that he could never live like that, was not his swadharma. His swadharma was a warrior, not living as a mendicant on alms. If he had gone to the forest, what would he have done? Very soon he would have been hunting deer and elephant and so on. He would have fallen back to his own nature. He would not have been able to spend his time in meditation and living on alms. That was not Arjuna's swadharma. So he was totally bewildered about his duty as a kshatriya. What to speak of recognizing the true spiritual nature of himself and the others that he was about to face. He did not see that. Now, in general, each chapter of the Gita, 18 chapters, each chapter in the Gita is considered a yoga. And what is yoga? Is a means to reunite ourself as we are now with our true self. So each chapter is dedicated to that. So the first 6 chapters of the Gita, chapter 1 through 6, describes the stages of a person in a limited self-awareness, one with limited self-awareness, to and including an expanded sense of self through right action, discrimination, and knowledge. And in chapter 2, Sri Krishna describes one's swabhava, one's true nature, to Arjuna, and gives the eloquent description of a stita prajna, a man or a person of steady wisdom. Chapters 7 through 12 describe various aspects of the divine, the all-pervasiveness of the divine. It's the divine presence in our life, that the divine exists in the heart of everyone. And in chapter 12, Sri Krishna extols devotion as the supreme means for the attainment of the Supreme Self. Chapters 13 to 18 detail the process of transmuting the self and uniting with our true self. So clearly, Sri Krishna's emphasis in the Gita, this is a broad classification. He's dealing with this idea of ourself as we are now. Arjuna obviously is totally unaware of his spiritual dimension of himself. He can't even focus on the proper dimension of himself as a kshatriya. He's completely overwhelmed with delusion. Now, before entering Sri Krishna's perspective on this subject, most interesting subject of self, and how we can make self-forgetfulness into a yoga, let's consider a few ideas regarding self-identity that we have in Vedanta. And this will help us to understand Arjuna's confusion, his ultimate dilemma, and Sri Krishna's resolution to that problem. And what I would like to do is present this idea of self in a very practical way, not in a philosophical or metaphysical way. We need those ideas. But unless we can take the concepts of Vedanta, these ideas, and make them real in our lives as we are, we have to be able to incorporate these ideas into our life. This is how they become part of us. If it's not part of our life, it simply remains as a concept or an idea, and that's fine for intellectual understanding, but that does not help to transform our life. So wherever we are, whatever we're doing, we have to be able to take the ideas of Vedanta and make them real for us as we are. So let us look at it from that perspective. Now, the concept of self in Vedanta emanates from the particular self, myself. We're all familiar with our own self. We know it firsthand. We don't have to speculate about it. We know it. We're living it every moment of our lives. But the question arises, who are you really? Have we thought about it? What is our real identity? Now, say Homeland Security comes and they ask you, who are you? And you might say, well, I'm Jane Smith, and I live in San Francisco, and I work in the financial district, et cetera, et cetera. Then they're going to ask you for a photo ID and your national identity card with some DNA information, an iris scan, a fingerprint, et cetera, et cetera. When Homeland Security is convinced that your physical identity matches who you say you are, they're satisfied with that. That's who you are. That's who I am. You go anywhere, you come in the airport, they say to you, let me see your ID, and you show them your driver's license. Have you ever thought about the implications of this? This is who I am. So every moment of our lives, we're reinforcing, of course, the wrong notion of who we are. That's the practical side of our life, and we have to live in and through that. Then if we go for a job, say, what do? Well, they want a resume, and they want your, quote, biodata. When a person is convinced that you have a particular skill set for a job or a position, they're satisfied. And if it's good enough, they'll hire you. And then we have so many things, so many recreational activities and hobbies and so on, talents and skills, and we say, oh, I'm an excellent tennis player. I'm a soprano in the choir. I love playing the guitar, so many things. All of these we predicate to ourselves. I am this, I'm that. And then we have so many relationships. I may be a mother or a father, sister, brother, husband, wife. So all of us are a bundle, a combination of all of these identities. Physical identity, mental, emotional, we have all of these identities. And sometimes these identities collide. And we question. We're confused. Arjuna was confused. And we say, who are we really? If we think about it, who am I really? Am I sure this is all that I am? Or is there something more? So as I said, Arjuna, from the very beginning, Arjuna was overwhelmed by this confusion. And we already get that hint when he asks Sri Krishna to drive his chariot between the armies to see who he's going to fight. And he already knows who he's going to fight, but he wants to see it. And that's the basis of his confusion. Now, some of you may be familiar with the book Alice in Wonderland. Anyone familiar with this children's book? Good. So Swami Vivekananda thought that Alice in Wonderland was the best book written for children in the 19th century. And he felt that Lewis Carroll, the author of the book, had an uncanny insight into the workings of the human mind. And if anyone who has read it, especially from a Vedantic perspective, you can understand this. A wonderful, marvelous book. And Swamiji loved it. Whenever he was with children, he would often read to them from this book. And in fact, he quoted from it and mentioned it in lectures in New York and in Los Angeles. So Swamiji held the book in high regard. Just for the sort of stream of consciousness activities that go on and the disconnected things that happen just as they happen in our minds and in our life. So I'm introducing this by way of a conversation between Alice and a caterpillar that I'm about to tell you. So in Alice in Wonderland, Alice is walking through a garden. And there on a mushroom, all kinds of things happen in Alice in Wonderland, like dreams, disconnected things. There's a caterpillar, a very grave caterpillar, and he's smoking a hookah. And Alice is going through the garden. And he leans over the mushroom and he says to her, "Who are you?" Now Alice was taken aback a little bit, being addressed by a talking caterpillar, as you would be if you were in a garden and a caterpillar started to speak to you. She was a little taken aback. And she says, "Well, sir, I knew who I was when I woke up this morning, but I think perhaps I have changed several times since then." And the caterpillar looks at her and he says, "What do you mean by that? Explain yourself." And Alice said, "Oh, I can't explain myself, sir. I'm afraid I can't explain myself because, you see, I'm not myself." And the caterpillar says, irritated, "I don't see." And Alice says, "Well, I can't put it more clearly, I'm afraid, for I can't understand it myself." Now, from this conversation, we can extract that we all have a little bit of Alice in us. We can't explain our current condition. We hear these high ideals, we hear our true nature, and yet we know what we are. We can't explain it. And when push comes to shove, we don't know our true identity because it's constantly changing. Just like Arjuna, we too are in the midst of an identity crisis from the standpoint of spiritual reality. Now, in our ordinary state of consciousness, ordinary state of existence, being separate from others is who I am. And although in fact we know scientifically and every other way that all molecules of matter are interchangeable, and mind is one, practically speaking, there is a physical separation. My lump of matter distinguishes me from your lump. And my mind vibrates differently than other minds. We know that from a practical point of view. And I identify with a particular psychophysical system, say Jane Smith. So I act and I think and I experience everything as this distinct individual. No matter what we do, any of us, what we do, we think, or we say, we are aware that we exist. You can never disprove or deny your own existence, and no one else can either. You know you exist. Isn't it true? You know, you're aware, you're sitting here, you exist. So there can't be any physical or mental activity without this awareness. That's the bottom line. Now, according to Vedanta, this identification, this misidentification that we have, that we think that we're this combination of body and mind and intellect, it's created by what we would call metaphysical ignorance or jnana. Jnana, it's just a word. All of these things are words trying to indicate a state of being. And our teachers and our philosophers, they use various words to try to actually describe a state of experience. And that, to me, was the most important thing about Arjuna going between the two armies. He had to experience it. He knew it in theory, but he had to experience it. So this is what happens. So we experience ourselves like this, and it's because of this mistaken notion, this ajnana, call it Maya. Now, although we assume new physical bodies, if we accept the law of reincarnation, this body drops, we accept it, we get a new body, but the subtle tendencies, the linga shura, these mental tendencies, go with us through successive births. And because there's no limit to the carry-on baggage, we often come with quite a load. They don't say we have to store it up in the upper bin. We have several bins that we can store it in. So we all come life after life with all of these tendencies. And each life we reinforce that we are this limited person. This is just to give us a background. So this pernicious sense that I am what I think I am, in Vedanta it's described as kind of a knot between matter and spirit. Chid jara granti, a knot between matter and spirit. It's not a very satisfactory explanation, if we can even call it so, but that is how it is explained. that there is a knot between matter and spirit. And that knot is what constantly causes this confusion between our spiritual self and our experience of ourselves as we are at present. And if left unexamined, this is who we assume we are. But as spiritual seekers, we're asked to examine. We're asked to look at this. We're asked to look at this changing, shifting nature of the I. Alice knew who she was when she woke up, but she knew that she'd changed several times since she woke up, so she couldn't figure out which identity is my identity. We're constantly shifting our identities. We know that as we go through life. If we can look at that shifting nature of the I, it gives us a clue that we are something other than what we think we are. There is this hidden possibility. There's something else. Am I something else? Yes, we are something else. So like Alice, our I changes in various states of consciousness. Now this is described very in detail philosophically in the Mandukya Upanishad. The states of waking, dream, and deep sleep and the Turiya state are analyzed extensively and philosophically, but we're going to put it in very practical terms. Now the I in the waking state that's so busy, frantically busy, front and center, that ego, when we fall asleep, what happens? That identity vanishes completely. And a new identity comes. We get a dream ego. Maybe we're Queen Elizabeth or we're whatever. We get another identity, and with that identity comes a whole new set of props. I mean, maybe we're suddenly living in Saudi Arabia or we're riding on an elephant. So many things happen, and it's real for us at that moment. We have a completely different identity in our dream state. If we go into deep sleep state, that identity in the waking state and the dream state, gone. And we wake up the next morning and we say, oh, I had a wonderful sleep. I wasn't aware of anything. But from where does this experience come if we weren't there to experience it? If we weren't there to remember that we had this experience, how could we say, oh, I slept so well? So if the I of our waking state, as we all right now, I don't see anybody asleep, but they may be in a few minutes if I don't hurry up. So the I in the waking state, as we are right now at this very moment, how could it completely disappear in dream and deep sleep if it was the real reality? We would experience the same reality all the time as we do right now with everything surrounding us, but we don't. We have an entirely different experience. We're not aware of ourselves and our surroundings in other states of consciousness as we are in our waking state. That's not what happens. So our spiritual masters point out there is a witness, what we call a witness self, the permanent ground of the ego that's ever aware, registering all experiences or the lack thereof. That's how we can say, oh, I slept well. Our conscious mind, we're not there to say, I can say I'm experiencing this, I'm standing here. But if I'm in deep sleep, I'm not aware of those things in the same way. So daily we are getting hints of our true nature and we're ignoring it. It's right there for us to see. I cannot be this changing entity. And yet, as I just mentioned, there is a continuity of our being. We feel that there's a continuity. We don't feel when we wake up in the morning that we're an entirely different person. There's a continuity. It's a subtle continuity. We ascribe all sorts of other things to it, our physical identities and all that, but there's a subtler continuity underneath it all. So the conclusion has to be there's a subtle dimension of ourself that is permanent, that is immortal. And Arjuna was conflicted regarding this fact because of his personal attachment. Sri Krishna tells him, why are you worried? All of these beings, they're already slayed by me. There's nothing permanent here. They're already dead. So Krishna's slowly going to take him into a higher teaching of the self. Arjuna's completely overwhelmed because he's thinking of them as his mother or his father or whatever, his relatives, these psychophysical beings. and his personal attachment causes him to collapse. So if we look a little closer, we can see that initially Arjuna was unable to understand this innate awareness of immortality that we all have, the sense that we aren't going to die. None of us can really imagine our own death. Not because we're necessarily afraid of death, but the fact is we aren't going to die. Our true nature is immortal. It's impossible to imagine that we would be extinguished. So this sense that we are not going to die in an odd sort of way, it prods us to seek permanence in the outside in things that are impermanent. Basically, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to ascribe permanence in a relationship or in a job or whatever it happens to be. It's all coming from inside because we are immortal. We are that impermanent, imperishable self. But because of this delusion, this knot between matter and spirit, we try to seek permanence in the outside. And that's what Arjuna was doing. Okay, so the next step, what's the connection between the awareness that we have of ourself as we are now and our spiritual self? What's the connection? Now you all know all of our Vedantic mystics, including Sri Krishna, Sri Ramakrishna, all, Swami Vivekananda, they say there's only one self. Okay, so what do we mean by self? It has a capital S, as far as we're concerned. That's the difference. It's just a word. But what they mean is there's one pure awareness. That's that subtle underground awareness that's registering all of these experiences that we're having. That awareness, that consciousness is one. And all of us experience it in various ways. How? It depends upon our perception, which in turn is determined by our level of consciousness. So, for example, Swami Vivekananda says in Jnana Yoga, if you had a sixth sense, you would perceive a whole different level of reality. So you have it's all in one, this matter, et cetera, et cetera. So if your level of consciousness is basically entrenched in the world of matter, because that's your identity, you're going to see everything in terms of matter. If you rise a little higher and you yourself see things in terms of mind, say of ideas, we see this in, say, professors or people who are interested in more refined pursuits than just the material world, their minds dwell in this realm of ideas, much subtler level of reality. I'll give you a humorous example. One time, Einstein, he was living in Princeton. He had left Germany. He was living in Princeton and in the midst of all of his research and everything. And you know the story of Einstein. He was completely lived in another world. And someone said, "Professor, have you had your lunch?" And Einstein said, "Lunch." He said, "Am I walking away from my house or toward it? If I'm walking toward my house, I haven't had lunch. If I'm walking in the opposite direction, I have." So he either had his lunch or not, but the point is his mind was dwelling on another level, a higher level of ideas and formulas and so on and so forth. So this world of matter and something as common as eating was not something that was very important to him. So that kind of gives us an idea of these various levels of perception. Now, Sri Ramakrishna gives a very homely, simple example. I like this example very much in terms of trying to understand this so-called ego. He said, think of it this way. You have a body of water and you take a stick and you throw the stick in the water. So the stick's in the water and it appears to be divided. You have some water on the right, you have some water on the left. It's divided into two, myself and the other. If you take that stick of the ego out of the water, it becomes one. So if we can somehow overcome this self-forgetfulness, the big self, by taking this stick of the ego out of the water, that ocean of consciousness is one. But here's the tricky part. There's always a tricky part. And the short story becomes long, but I'll try not to make it too long. Our relative self as we know it is not real. We know that. Whether we accept it or not, we know we're all going to die. We know, physically speaking, as somebody said, none of us are going to get out of this alive. We can't live maybe beyond 100, and John McCain's mother, I think, was 106. But beyond that, pretty much a human lifespan is considered, according to the Ishu Upanishad, 100 years. Our physical body's going to fall off. We know that. It's perishable. And as far as we're concerned, our mind is extremely limited. Yes, we carry these tendencies from life to life, which determines the course in the next life, but our mind is limited. No matter how hard we strive, there's always a wall that we cannot get over. There's always much more knowledge that we will never be able to understand or in this life. So this was Arjuna's mistaken perception, and this is what caused him so much grief. His identity with this relative awareness and not recognizing that it's different than the spiritual. So it is and it isn't. What's the answer to the riddle? Is there any answer to the riddle? Why Maya? No, we can't come up, as Swami Vivekananda said. It's a statement of facts. This is how things are going on. And Swamiji would say the Hindus are very honest. They'll just say, I don't know. I can't tell you. I cannot tell you how it began, but we know that it can have an end. We know this from all of our enlightened masters, spiritual masters of all traditions, that this limited state of existence has an end. We cannot trace it to the beginning. And furthermore, this sense of duality, this sense of otherness that we have, we know that ultimately it is a delusion, just like when we fall into sleep. Our identity in our waking state vanishes, and we have a different ego. We're not even exposed to the external world. We create, as the Upanishad says, we create roads and chariots and buildings, and we create a whole other universe in our dream state. So the bottom line is, we have to be satisfied by saying the self, this ultimate state of awareness, appears as this limited being. That's the best explanation, if we can call it an explanation. Short of a direct experience of ourself as a spiritual being. That's the only thing that will be the final conclusive evidence, is what we perceive another dimension within ourselves. Now, interestingly, one explanation for this appearance of our I consciousness is that it's just a mental concept. So think about that. It's just a mental concept. When we come into this world as individuals, can any of you remember where you were before you were born? Or how you got here? I mean, maybe if you're a yogi and your mind is in that direction, you probably could. But basically, we don't know where we come from. We don't know how we got here. What we know, at some point in our lives, we recognize ourselves as a separate being. When we're babies, basically, I suppose you can say an infant or a baby, they're closest to the state of oneness because they don't recognize separation. They have more of a sense of oneness. So it's only as they become indoctrinated, as we start to grow, and we're given a name, and we're given this, and we're given that, and so many things are superimposed upon the soul at that juncture that we become crystallized, individualized beings. And then we go on identifying with those things, and we predicate endless qualities to ourselves. And we say things like, oh, I'm so cold. I'm so hungry, I need to lose weight. All of these things we say about our I, our pure I am consciousness, we don't know. And so we're constantly putting these predicates onto ourselves and accepting that as ourself. And life after life, we go on trying to figure out who we are and what's the point of all of this. But our search is misdirected. This is the problem. So we go through the same experiences again and again and again, and if this isn't enough, we're always seeking novel experiences, something new. Because the senses and the mind get jaded and we want something new. But for a thoughtful person, they will see that gradually everything erodes and crumbles. And after some time, it disappears. as if it never existed at all. We can see that in our own life. If you think of something, maybe some spectacular experience you had 10 or 15 years ago, and somebody asks you about it, you're like, let's see, what happened? I mean, we just don't retain those kinds. Everything is subject to change in this relative world, and it all corrodes, including people. Out of sight, out of mind. And after some time, it all disappears. So when some awakening dawns for a spiritual seeker, and he begins to think about these things and question this mechanical cycle. How can I get out of this mechanical cycle that's spinning us around like the spin cycle of a wash machine? That's what's happening. Round and around we're going. But for spiritual seekers, we want to put it on the pause button. We want to stop going round and round and face it and try to see who we are. Now, the Virajaprana Upanishad says, and this is like a segue from this experience to the ultimate experience. It's not for the sake of the husband and the wife and the children, etc., that all of these are cherished and loved. It's for the sake of the spiritual self in them. That's the attracting force and power in the other person. It's not for the sake. Initially it is. Initially it's our egocentric wish and desire, and therefore we seek a relationship with someone else. We love our children. It's all centered on our small self, and it's egocentric and it's limited. Yes, that's true. But when our sense of self expands into something larger, we see, no, that's not the basis of my relationship. I love that person. I'm attracted to that person. Why? Not because of the physical or mental, but because of the divine spirit. That's the only attracting power in the universe, according to the Upanishads. The divine is the only attracting power. It's just we cover it over. So this is why I mentioned in the beginning, this is the most difficult issue to deal with in our spiritual life. And this is why Sri Krishna's teachings are so beneficial. They're so practical. Our identity is so deeply entrenched in who we think we are that it becomes very difficult to extricate ourselves from it. Because every moment, it's like Sri Ramakrishna says, you can cut down a tree or something, then the first rain, the roots come, the whole thing sprouts again when he's talking about the ego. You think you've gotten rid of it, and the next moment, it's like Rakta Bija in the Chandi. Every drop of blood's a demon. It's the same thing. It's not that easy. But when we understand the basis of it, it becomes easier to deal with it. That's the point. And this is where Sri Krishna helps. Now Arjuna, we get caught in it. And that's the real cause of all of our problems and our troubles and our sufferings. We always think, oh, it's because of this, it's because of her, it's because of him, it's the country, it's Trump. It's all these, it's nothing to do with any of those things. It's not coming from the outside. The problem doesn't exist outside, really. So all of our sufferings and even our joys and our happiness, they're ultimately disappointing. Why? Because they come to an end. The best relationship comes to an end, sometimes tragically. Everything in this universe is limited, and when we really focus on that, we start to get a strong vairagya or desire for something. I want something that's permanent, some joy that no matter what, I'm never going to be separated from it. That's what we really want. But we're just looking for it in the wrong place. So the ego is constantly making its presence felt. It causes confusion and chaos wherever it goes. We can think of it sort of like an unruly house guest. We just can't get rid of them. They don't want to go. So how do we get rid of this unwanted guest that won't leave? Uninvited guest to dinner. So we have to cajole the guest. The Gita says, you're your worst enemy, but you're also your best friend. So you have to befriend yourself by yourself. You can't depend on someone else. Be a friend to yourself. Be easy on yourself. Lift yourself by yourself. This is what Krishna says. So the obvious thing is, the first step is to divert our attention away from this I. Everything in the universe we want to center here. So we start to diffuse and divert the attention from the I. This is the basis of all ethics and morality in all religions, by being selfless. And there are many ways to do that. Everything else is just an explanation of this one central fact. Take the attention away from myself. So let's just look for a moment, what's the actual process? Let's look at the practical application of trying to make this self-forgetfulness, and we're keeping Arjuna in mind. How can we make this a yoga? How do we spiritualize it? He's in a mess. He's terribly depressed. So how do we, and many of us face that, some strong emotion. How can we turn that and make that a yoga? There are two components. One is internal, the other is external. So internally, we need to shift our identity. That's the main thing. You know, this is a relative world. Everything's connected to something else. We're related, not just to people, but we're connected in so many ways. That's why there's so many problems in nature and so on. Ecology's in such a big mess because man's made it a big mess. We're connected here. We operate and try to think that we're supreme as a species. And we're not connected. We are connected. We're connected with everything in the universe. Every person, every tree, every plant, every bird, every animal, one existence. So we have to shift our identity. That's the main thing. So right now we think we're Jane Smith. How do I shift my identity? The main thing is we have to connect to something. Can't remain in a void. So we want to connect with a spiritual identity. So we might say, well, some people, temperamentally, of course, it depends on one's inclination. We might say, I'm a child of God. God is my mother. God is my best friend, like Arjuna and Sri Krishna. Yes, he was his teacher, but Krishna was his best friend. That's why Arjuna could bare his soul the way he did. As a great warrior, he let down all of his guards because Krishna was his dearest friend. And he knew that Krishna had his best interest at heart. So we can think of that. The Lord has my best interest at heart. He's my best friend, or she's my best friend, like that. Some kind of a relationship. Our I am consciousness has to be hooked up with something spiritual in order to make this transition in our self-identity. It makes sense, doesn't it? Because we're identified with all these things we've been talking about. We want to shift our identity. That's the beauty of Vedanta. There's not any one way. It's left open to the individual. There's so many relationships, so many attitudes that one can have toward the divine. We have to think about it. What do we mean by divine? What do we mean by Divine Mother? What do we mean by God other than the words? What's the essence of that? And how can I form a relationship with that divine being? When we start focusing like that, our attention starts to go away from this identity as we ordinarily have it. So, for example, a devotee of God feels that he or she belongs to God. And they feel that others are God's children. He resigns himself to the divine will. He's an instrument in the hands of the divine. So the devotee knows that he has no personal claim on results or people or whatever. You know, Job said in the Old Testament, God gave and God taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord, when he lost his son. And there are devotees. We know there are examples, many examples. I'll give you one example. There was a devotee in Chennai, and I think he had maybe only one son. That son was tragically killed in an accident, and that gentleman had a particular duty at the temple and to do with Sashi Maharaj Swami Ramakrishnananda's service for some celebration. The son had just been, something happened, and this gentleman appears at the ashram, and the swamis couldn't believe it. It was like the son had, and they're like, this tragedy just happened, why are you here? He said, why should I give up this opportunity to serve Sashi Maharaj? So that is what is meant by a devotee. We give our everything, we focus everything towards the divine. If we can have that kind of, it's a very simple person, but it was wholehearted. So that terrible tragedy did not throw him off from his simple service at the ashram. So somehow we have to relate ourselves so that it becomes so important. It's not that he was hard-hearted about the death of his son. No, that wasn't the point. I'm sure he wept and it was terrible. But the point is he had another anchor. He had something to anchor. If we don't, we're just floating in space. If a person's not inclined to worship a personal God, perhaps they're more inclined to the path of knowledge. It's a little more difficult, and Sri Krishna mentions this in the Gita, but that person maybe tries to see the ego as an illusion, separate the changeful from the unchanging, etc. And a karma yogi would say, I'm not working, nature's working through me. So there are different ways through the different yogas, and frankly, we're all kind of a combination. We're devotees, we're jnanis, we're Raja yogis. It's very difficult to say any one individual is a watertight compartment. We have so many elements in our personalities, and we should think of it in that way, because then depending on our mood or the circumstance, we can relate to the divine in various ways. It's not, we have to have one way. Sometimes we may be in a different mood and we think, I am the Atman, I'm pure spirit, etc. Another time, Mother bless me. So if a spiritual seeker can have kind of this all-rounded approach to not being stuck in one path or this or that, but simply trying to feel that the divine is my own, that's the truth, then there's a much better possibility of relating in that way in various ways, because our life doesn't go on in a smooth transition. There's constant ups and downs and unexpecteds. The second component, besides the internal, is the external aspect of action. Now, normally, for our work, we have some kind of a motive for our work. I mean, besides just making money to live. So it might be for prestige, it might be for power, it might be reputation or ambition or whatever. Anyway, there are various motives. And we are drawn, no doubt, to certain kinds of works because of our natural proclivities and our tendencies. We all have natural inclinations. So, somebody's naturally inclined to become a biologist, or somebody's naturally inclined to become a scientist, or whatever. And according to the Gita, that's the basis of swadharma. We observe where our natural energy flows. Where is it flowing naturally? Many people ask, how do you know what your swadharma is? We have to be observant and see where our mind and our energies flow naturally. I don't mean just in a sensual sense, not that. Just in the sense of what direction my life is going to take. And we see, kind of where we fit in the cosmic scheme of things. And that is the basis for swadharma. But unfortunately, what happens is we often identify with what we do, and then we get stuck. That's what happens, because this identity comes. So to let go of all of our personal investment, it's not that easy. Our identity and our meaning for existence are tied together, because we think that we are this, and whatever we're associated out there is part of this, and so it's hooked. So to let go of personal investment, it's kind of like spiritual seekers jump off a cliff. We have to be prepared to break away from our sense of individuality as we know it. Our individuality is at stake here in spiritual life. We have to be willing to let go of this identity if we ever hope to make inroads into our spiritual identity. So living and working without a personal motive, of course, it requires sustained training of the mind and self-restraint. That's the whole basis of yoga, self-restraint. We're so used to self-expression, but in spiritual life, it's self-restraint. Not just self-restraint for its own sake, but for a higher purpose. So following that line of thought, we can't just suddenly say, well, okay, I'm not going to take my expectations seriously anymore. I don't care whether people praise or blame me, or I get recognition, or somebody else gets recognition for what I do. That's fine. It doesn't work that way. It's not that easy. And we all know how hard it is to live and interact with people gracefully. The ego has to be sacrificed on the altar of self-restraint. We can make that a mantra. We have to sacrifice, be willing to sacrifice everything that we cherish around this false self on the altar of self-restraint, pulling the self back. Why? Because we're going to get something much better. And one thing we have to remember is that reactions do come, because the one thing that the ego won't tolerate is being ignored. It thrives on attention. That's the nature of the ego. So the reason I'm mentioning all these things is, in a way, if we can kind of separate the ego out, it's almost like we're dealing with another person in that sense. We're trying to remove the ego from the equation, so we can't snub it and get away with it. We have to make the ego our friend so that we can transmute it into something else. And how are we going to do this? So the very first thing is, coming back to the beginning, there has to be a strong motive for getting rid of this guest, for wanting to shift our self-awareness. For spiritual seekers, they have that motive. It may be lukewarm, it may be this or that, but all of you would not be here listening to this long-winded discourse on self-forgetfulness if you didn't have an interest in spiritual life. You might be walking in the park or playing tennis or something else. So you have an interest in trying to figure out, how am I going to awaken the spiritual dimension in myself? And why aren't I aware of it? Swamiji's constantly saying, open your eyes and see him. Our eyes are open physically. So this is what we need to take the next step. And that's what we're talking about. So one of the obvious reasons for wanting to, there are two reasons. One of the obvious reasons for wanting to shift away from this limited self is it's so painful. Very painful. Why is it painful? Because our constricted state of existence is fragile, it's fickle, it's insecure. You know, the Virajaprana Upanishad says this relative bundle is held together by what? By desires, by doubts, by misery, by attachment, happiness, all of these things, all of which are dependent on the outside, and they're not under our control. So when we center ourselves in that and we stay in that state of existence, we're naturally going to be in chaos all the time, because we have no control of what happens outside. We don't know what's going to happen the next minute. This is a very dangerous world. So if my happiness and my joy is completely dependent on something on the outside, whether it's a person or whatever, I'm in for trouble, because I have no control over that. I should focus on what I have control over, and that's myself. And what do I have control over? My reaction. My reactions to things. That's what I have control over. And that's what happened to Arjuna. He had a terrible, painful reaction in his mind, just imagining about what was to come. And Krishna is telling him, you're totally deluded. You need not have this reaction at all. So the point is, it's the reaction in our mind that makes us unhappy or happy, and so on and so forth. Though that's one of the main reasons we want to shift away into something larger, is that in this state, at this level, we have no control over it. You know, it's something like, if you think of a stage set, say at Universal Studios, and you look at the outside, it's so convincing, it's so elegant, it looks so real, but if you peek around the back of those stage sets, it's all hammered together. It's jerry-rigged, this plywood and this and this and that. It's really difficult to prop up something so flimsy like the ego. The ego's sort of like that, it's all hammered together. And that's why people are tense and they're anxious, and because the ego is extremely flimsy. And it's difficult to hold it together at this level in a stable condition. It's not possible. Okay, finally, Sri Krishna gives us many practical suggestions about shifting our identity from this selfish state in terms of action, and that we all know. The Bhagavad Gita is the Bible for non-attached work and for worship of God, making our work a service or worship. Why? Because these practices are life-oriented. Whether we call ourselves karmis or raja yogis or devotees, whatever it is, we all have to work. Every single one of us has some work we have to do. So without changing our work, whatever it may happen to be, You know, it's like Swamiji said at the Parliament of Religions, you know, am I asking a Christian to become, you know, a Hindu? God forbid. Am I asking a Hindu to become? No. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, should you become a monk or a nun? No, that's not for you. Should I do something? No, that's not. So each person, it's not a matter of competition or higher or lower. We have to find where we fit into the cosmic scheme, and on that stage, we undergo our own self-evolution. And there's no superiority, inferiority in this. So without changing our work, whatever it happens to be, what do we have control over? We have control over our attitude, our internal. That's what we have control over. So how to get from this limited self to the bigger self? That's how we do it. We have to change our attitude. You know, a person could be a millionaire and be completely detached. Janaka, I don't know, we call him a millionaire, but in days of yore, he had a huge kingdom. He wasn't attached to it. And a person may have only a few possessions, maybe a loincloth, and they're very attached to it. So when you look at that, you realize that the world isn't the problem, as I just said earlier. The world isn't the difficulty. The difficulty is worldliness. And worldliness means attachment. Selfishness. Worldliness doesn't mean, you know, I drive a Lexus and I have a big house. Fine. That doesn't necessarily mean the person's worldly. Worldly, again, it's a concept, it's a state of mind. This is why all of this is totally in our hands, what we can do about it, because it depends on our attitude and our reaction. And this is what binds us. Not the work and not people. So the suggestion is, if we can separate ourselves, as I was just saying, remain as a witness, however we perceive of that, and do our work. It's like Krishna says, any work can become a means for self-revelation. Any unselfish activity. If you do the work, any activity, without sense of self, no action will bind you, regardless of the action. You know, Swami Vivekananda used to say, my greatest work has been work that I did without thought of self. That's what Swamiji said. Of course, every work of Swamiji's was great. But he said, whenever I brought myself into something, it was a big mess. When I left myself out of it, everything went smoothly. So normally, we're all wrapped up in ourselves and we dissipate our energy and so on and so forth. When we take this paradigm and try to open ourselves up to something larger, we tap into an infinite source of energy and power because we're not constrained by this small self. And that's what karma yoga is really all about, in 2 sentences: converting ordinary work into a means for one's own liberation and for the good of others. I mean, Sri Krishna is not interested in having a theoretical, organized, systematic philosophy of work. That's not his goal. And when you read the Gita, you realize it's not a systematized philosophical text. There's a lot of philosophical ideas there, but the ideas are scattered throughout the Gita. Some chapters you'll find, you know, ideas of karma yoga, bhakti yoga in various chapters. It's not organized 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in that sense. That's not the way the Gita is presented. Krishna is interested in life, and that's how we start it. We want to make it, it has to be practical to me. Otherwise, it doesn't have any meaning for me. I mean, at least for me. So for Krishna, the issue is life itself. And according to him, in the Gita, we always are active. No one can remain in this world without activity. So it just makes sense that it's the most practical suggestion that he's giving us to utilize our work as a means for becoming self-forgetful by changing our attitude. And when we do that, this sort of natural self-forgetfulness starts to come. Say, for example, just a simple example. Say you're a caregiver for a patient, or you're a mother and you have children, and you're a good mother or you're a good caregiver. At that moment when you're caring for another person, your whole attention and focus is on that person. At least for the time being, your self-interest are put on hold, at least for the time being. And there's an expansion, a joy that comes from that. So many people who are involved in altruistic, even just, humanism activities, report this feeling of expansion Why? They're not doing it for themselves. They're not doing it for name and fame. They're not doing that. They're going to get something out of it, even whether they're being paid for it or not. There's a natural expansion that comes when we remove this idea of self that we have, and even in ordinary people that aren't conscious spiritual seekers report feeling like that when they're involved in selfless charitable activities. So we have to look for the deeper source of that. And Krishna says, this is called dexterity in action. In the Gita, yoga karmasu kaushalam, skill and action. This is yoga. And this is what Krishna is basically about to tell Arjuna. We started on the battlefield and we're going to leave them there. And the whole Gita proceeds from that. And he's going to instruct Arjuna how to lift himself out of this state of despondency into a state of self-awareness. And in the process of all of this, as we practice, when we are practicing unselfishness, we purify ourselves. And what happens when we say purify ourselves? What we're doing is all the dross is being removed. And when that happens, we begin to realize that we're simply uncovering something that's already there. It's not that we're bringing something in. We're not going to achieve something. It's not like, effect and cause. It's there. We're uncovering it by these practices. And it starts to shine in us. So that's the real motive. Our spiritual seekers see the great spiritual masters. They're calm, they're serene, they're blissful, they're centered in their true self. They're all loving and compassionate. They have no attachment. They don't have anything to gain or lose. They're free. And this is what spiritual seekers, this is what we're all looking for. We want expansion of consciousness, this freedom, and I think especially happiness and joy that cannot be affected by anything. So in conclusion, we can say when we begin to forget ourselves, our identity begins to change. Surely it's slow, but we'll see increments in that. When we become truly unselfish, we begin to feel a kind of oneness and a non-separateness from others. And we feel that divine spirit pervades everything. Humans, plants, the whole universe, we will begin to see that divine spirit pervading everything. And this is the goal of the yoga of self-forgetfulness. Thank you.